A luxury boutique manager humiliated Ivanka Trump, but her comeback came as a shock to everyone. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching us from. Ivanka Trump stepped out of the black SUV onto the gleaming pavement of Fifth Avenue. The towering glass windows of designer boutiques reflected the January light, cold and sharp, like the stares she had already begun to notice. She adjusted the collar of her camel-colored coat, its soft cashmere folds a shield against the wind, and perhaps against the scrutiny she had grown so accustomed to. As she stood by the curb, the uniformed driver closed the door behind her with a muted thud. For a moment, she hesitated. The street felt louder than usual, the shuffle of pedestrians and honking horns amplified by her own awareness of being observed. A man in a faded Yankees cap snapped a photo with his phone, pretending to text. Two teenagers whispered and pointed before walking past, giggling nervously. Ivanka clenched her leather gloves and pushed forward. She was used to this, used to the eyes that followed her like searchlights. Once she had thrived on attention, but today she wanted invisibility. The boutique, however, was not the place to find it. Inside, the air was warmer, scented faintly with jasmine and polished wood. Crystal chandeliers cast intricate shadows across marble floors, and the muted hum of string music floated through the space. She exhaled slowly, letting the scent and stillness calm her nerves. The boutique was the definition of exclusivity. Clean lines, curated displays, and an unspoken rule that only a select few could belong here. The kind of place where discretion was currency and reputation mattered more than price tags. It was precisely why she had chosen it. Ivanka walked past the velvet ropes at the entrance, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She approached a glass display case lined with silk cushions, each supporting an object so perfectly lit it seemed untouchable. She paused, studying a selection of handbags, artworks in leather and gold. She had done her research. One bag in particular caught her eye, a deep emerald green clutch with intricate embroidery and a diamond-encrusted clasp. It was a statement piece, but not ostentatious. Perfect for her client, a woman who valued elegance and subtlety over flash. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "May I help you?" Ivanka turned. The woman standing before her wore a sharp black suit, her blonde hair coiled in a severe bun. She looked Ivanka over with the precision of someone who could assess a person's worth in seconds. "Yes," Ivanka said. "I'm looking for something special. A gift." The woman tilted her head. Her smile was professional, but there was something brittle about it, as if she were holding back an opinion. "For someone specific?" Ivanka met her gaze. "Yes, for a client. She's fond of timeless pieces." The woman nodded slowly, as though filing this information away. "We have several collections that might suit her taste. Of course," her eyes flicked almost imperceptibly to the door, "we cater to a very particular clientele." Ivanka felt the weight of the words. They were subtle, but clear. "You don't belong here." "I'm aware," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Could I see the newest arrivals?" The woman's lips pressed together. "Of course. I'll check what's available." She disappeared behind a velvet curtain, leaving Ivanka to feel the silence that followed. She glanced around and caught the eyes of two sales associates by the jewelry counter. They quickly looked away, but not before she heard one whisper, "Is that really her?" "God, she's so much smaller in person." Ivanka straightened her shoulders and turned away. She shouldn't have been surprised. Wherever she went, whispers followed. But it wasn't the whispers that unsettled her. It was the tone. Disdain. She stepped closer to the display case, pretending to study the designs, but her reflection in the glass stared back at her. Sharp cheekbones, hair pulled into a low chignon, makeup meticulously applied. She had built this look to shield herself, to project composure and control. Yet, even here, surrounded by wealth and beauty, she felt like an outsider. The curtains swayed and the woman returned empty-handed. "I'm afraid that particular piece may already be reserved," she said, clasping her hands in front of her. "Would you like me to check the other stores?" Ivanka's fingers tightened around her purse. "Reserved?" "Yes, for a regular client. We can always take your information in case it becomes available." The smile returned, sharper now. "You're not a regular client." "I'd like to see it anyway," Ivanka said. The woman's eyes flickered. "I'll need to double-check with the manager." And then she was gone again. Ivanka let out a slow breath. She had anticipated awkwardness, perhaps even politeness strained by resentment. But this was something else. Deliberate, calculated dismissal. She wasn't just being treated as an outsider, she was being tested. The minutes stretched. The sales associates near the counter exchanged glances. A man in a designer suit entered the store and immediately one of them rushed to assist him. Ivanka remained invisible. It reminded her of being 15 again, standing in the shadow of her father as he introduced her to executives in boardrooms, trying to sound older than she felt. She remembered the way they had smiled at her, indulgent and dismissive, while directing their attention to him. She had learned then to fight for attention. But now, she didn't want it. She wanted the bag, the sale, the respect. Simple transactions that shouldn't have required effort. The curtain moved again, but this time it wasn't the woman who emerged. A man followed her, tall, sharp-featured, with a silver tie and an expression that carried the authority of ownership. The manager. Ivanka prepared herself. "Miss Trump," he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed, "I understand you're interested in one of our special pieces. Unfortunately, we have very strict policies regarding exclusivity." She tilted her head. "Meaning?" "Meaning we reserve certain items for long-standing clients, those with histories we can verify." Ivanka's heart thudded, but her expression didn't waver. "And you assume I can't meet that requirement?" The manager's lips curved upward in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm sure you understand. Reputation means everything here." She did understand. Too well, but she wasn't leaving without a fight. The manager's words lingered in the air like the faint scent of the boutique's jasmine perfume. Sweet, but sharp enough to sting. Ivanka felt the weight of every syllable, each one polished and calculated to cut while pretending to remain professional. She had faced subtle insults before, but there was something particularly brazen about this moment, as if the manager wanted her to feel small, to shrink under the magnitude of what her name represented. She did not flinch. Instead, she let a practiced smile settle on her lips, the kind of expression she had perfected in boardrooms and political meetings. It wasn't warmth, it was armor. "I understand the importance of reputation," she said, her voice calm, controlled. "But I wasn't aware that a history of purchases was required to make one." The manager's eyes flickered with something between amusement and condescension. "Exclusivity is part of our brand identity, Miss Trump. It ensures that our products remain symbols of taste and status." "And you think I lack both?" she asked, the edge in her voice barely masked. "Not at all," he said quickly, though the gleam in his eyes told another story. "I simply meant that our clientele values long-standing relationships. But I'm sure we can find something equally exceptional for you, Perhaps one of our seasonal items? The implication was clear. Seasonal, temporary, lesser. Ivanka's nails pressed lightly against the leather of her purse, her grip tightening. She knew she could end this quickly. A phone call, a name dropped, and this man would be scrambling to apologize. But that wasn't what she wanted. She didn't need special treatment. She needed to be treated like anyone else, a customer with the means and taste to shop here. Instead of responding, she allowed the moment to stretch just long enough to make the manager uncomfortable before turning her attention back to the emerald green clutch. "That one," she said, nodding toward the glass case. "I'd like to see it." The manager hesitated, then glanced at the sales associate standing near the counter. The woman, mid-20s with dark hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, looked uncertain but stepped forward, fumbling with the keys to unlock the case. As the associate carefully lifted the clutch and placed it on a velvet tray, the manager lingered nearby, watching closely. Ivanka reached out, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather. It was as exquisite as she had expected, luxurious but understated, perfect. But before she could fully admire it, a low murmur reached her ears. "Is that really her?" Ivanka didn't look up, but the words settled heavily in her chest. "Of course it is," another voice answered, barely a whisper. "Look at her. She probably expects us to roll out a red carpet." Ivanka's fingers tensed against the leather. "She's not even dressed for this place. Doesn't exactly scream high fashion." The voices belonged to two sales associates near the back of the boutique, their laughter barely concealed behind faux professionalism. One of them, a tall blonde with sharp features, glanced in her direction and quickly looked away when Ivanka caught her eye. The manager cleared his throat, drawing Ivanka's attention back to him. "This piece," he said, gesturing toward the clutch, "is part of a limited edition. It's priced at $42,000. I assume you'd like me to process the purchase." His tone made it sound more like a challenge than a question. Ivanka knew the game he was playing, testing her, daring her to prove she could afford it. It wasn't the price that bothered her, it was the principle. She didn't need to prove anything, and yet she felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her, the unspoken demand to justify her presence in this space. "Yes," she said simply. "Of course," he replied, but his eyes betrayed disappointment. He had expected her to back down. The sales associate returned with a tablet to process the payment, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed it to Ivanka. "We'll need to run a verification check," the manager said smoothly, as if it were standard procedure. Ivanka arched an eyebrow. "Verification?" "Yes," he said. "For high-value purchases, we confirm identity and payment details to protect both the store and the client." "And this is standard?" "For clients we don't have a prior relationship with." "Yes." The words hung between them. Another jab, another attempt to remind her that, despite her name, she was still an outsider here. Ivanka handed over her card without another word. The sales associate stepped away to process the payment, leaving Ivanka standing alone with the manager. She felt the eyes of the other staff members lingering on her, their whispers no longer muffled. She probably had to call Daddy to transfer funds. Imagine thinking money can buy taste. I bet she's only here for attention. Ivanka let out a slow breath, willing herself to remain composed. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about this moment felt different, more personal. She had walked into this store expecting luxury and professionalism, but what she had found was judgment wrapped in silk gloves. When the sales associate returned, her expression had shifted. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice tight. "It looks like there's an issue with the payment." Ivanka blinked. An issue? It was declined. The manager's eyes gleamed with something dangerously close to satisfaction. "Would you like us to try another card?" he asked, his voice smooth but tinged with mockery. Ivanka's heart pounded, but she refused to let her composure crack. "There's no issue with the card," she said firmly. "Run it again." The sales associate hesitated, glancing at the manager before retreating to try again. In the silence that followed, Ivanka felt the weight of every stare in the room. "She should just leave," one voice whispered. "Does she think she's above the rules?" Ivanka's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to breathe. This wasn't about a bag anymore. It wasn't even about the whispers. It was about power. Who had it and who didn't? And right now, they thought she didn't. But they were wrong. She just needed to decide how far she was willing to go to prove it. Ivanka's pulse hammered in her ears, but she didn't move. The sales associate had disappeared with her card, and the manager stood in front of her, his polished shoes rooted to the floor like he was guarding the velvet tray. The emerald green clutch rested there, a prize just out of reach. The whispers hadn't stopped. They buzzed around her, faint but insistent, like gnats that refused to leave no matter how many times she brushed them away. "She's just pretending to be calm. I bet she's panicking inside." "Declined? Seriously? She's probably living off handouts now." Ivanka's breath slowed. She had endured rumors before. During her father's campaign, during her time in the White House, during every business venture she had ever pursued. People always whispered. They whispered about nepotism, about privilege, about how she didn't deserve her success. But this felt sharper. It wasn't politics or tabloids. It was face to face. When the sales associate returned, her steps quickened as if she were walking on hot coals. She handed Ivanka the card, her expression pinched with forced professionalism. "It appears," she said carefully, "that the system flagged the transaction for additional review. It's not a rejection, it's a precaution due to the amount." Ivanka blinked slowly, absorbing the words. It was a plausible explanation, one she might have accepted under normal circumstances, but nothing about this situation felt normal. The manager spoke up before she could respond. "These policies exist to protect high-profile clients," he said. "I'm sure you understand." There it was again. That tone, a thin veneer of civility stretched over something brittle and mocking. Ivanka slid her card back into her wallet. "Let's try again." The manager hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the sales associate as though silently warning her not to let this escalate further. "No need," he said smoothly. "We can hold the item for you until the issue is resolved. Perhaps you'd like to return tomorrow." Ivanka stared at him, her calm beginning to crack. "I'm not coming back tomorrow," she said. "I'm here now, and I expect to complete this purchase now." The manager's expression hardened, though he masked it with a thin smile. "I'm afraid store policy prevents us from finalizing sales under uncertain circumstances. I'm sure you understand." The words echoed in her head. "I'm sure you understand." The room felt smaller. The walls, lined with mirrors and glass cases, seemed to close in. And still, the whispers continued. Maybe she can't afford it. Maybe this is her punishment. Ivanka's chest tightened. She had learned to hold herself together under pressure, smiling for cameras while journalists hurled questions, keeping her voice steady during congressional hearings, pretending not to notice the online comments that picked apart her every move. But this wasn't a camera or a hearing. This was a handbag, A handbag she had researched, selected, and come here to buy. A handbag she didn't need, but had chosen because it was perfect for a client who mattered. And yet, they were treating her like an imposter. She exhaled sharply and turned to the sales associate. "Run the card again," she said. "Now." The associate hesitated. "I said now." The room quieted. Even the whispers stopped. The air felt heavier, denser, as the sales associate retreated with the card. Ivanka turned back to the manager. "You don't like me," she said, her voice low but steady. "That much is clear, and you don't think I belong here. But let me remind you, my money spends just as easily as anyone else's." The manager's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. "And when this transaction goes through, which it will, you're going to realize that treating people the way you just treated me doesn't go unnoticed." The words hung between them, sharp and unyielding. Moments later, the sales associate returned. She looked paler than before. It went through. Ivanka reached for the receipt, but the associate hesitated. "There's one more thing," the associate said, her voice faltering. "We need an additional signature for verification. It's standard for purchases over $30,000. Ivanka's patience snapped. "It's not standard," she said coldly. "I know it's not. I've bought art, jewelry, real estate, and never, not once, has anyone asked for an extra signature. So don't insult me by pretending this is policy." The manager's smile thinned. "Miss Trump?" "No," she interrupted. "Enough." The boutique fell into silence. Ivanka stared at the manager, her breathing steady but her pulse pounding. She had spent her life walking into rooms where people either worshipped her last name or resented it. Today, she had been treated like a nuisance, like someone who didn't matter, and she wasn't going to stand for it. "You know what?" Ivanka said, stepping back from the counter. "Keep the bag." The manager blinked, surprised. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Keep it." She turned to leave, her heels clicking against the marble floor, but something held her back. She stopped, glanced over her shoulder, and spoke just loud enough for the whispers to carry. "I'll make sure the right people know what happened here today. Not just about me, but about how you treat anyone you think doesn't measure up." And then she walked out, head high even as her stomach churned. The cold air outside hit her like a slap, but it was grounding. She slipped into the back seat of her SUV, closing the door behind her as if shutting out the world. Her driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Ivanka stared at the boutique's gleaming windows. She could still see the manager through the glass, his smile gone, his posture rigid. "Drive," she said. As the SUV pulled away, Ivanka leaned back, her eyes closing for just a moment. She had walked away from the bag, but the fight wasn't over, not yet. The city blurred past the windows of the SUV, a haze of neon lights and faceless crowds. Ivanka sat rigid in the back seat, her hands clenched so tightly around her phone that her knuckles turned white. The boutique's interior still lingered in her mind. The scent of polished wood, the gleam of chandeliers, and above all, the smirking face of the manager. Her reflection in the tinted glass stared back, calm and composed on the surface, but her stomach churned. She'd walked out, left the bag, and turned her back on their condescension, and yet it didn't feel like a victory. Her phone buzzed in her lap, breaking the silence. A text from her assistant. "Checking in. Did you find a gift for Miss Harrington?" Ivanka stared at the screen. Miss Harrington, her biggest client. A woman who valued precision, elegance, and results. Failure wasn't an option. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard before she typed a curt reply. "Handling it." She wasn't about to let a petty boutique staff humiliate her. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "Turn around," she said suddenly, leaning forward toward the driver. He glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Ma'am, back to the boutique." The car slowed, merging into traffic. Ivanka's pulse quickened. She hadn't wanted to escalate the situation. She had wanted to rise above it, but they hadn't left her a choice. When the car pulled up in front of the boutique, she took a breath, fixed her coat, and stepped out. Her heels struck the pavement with sharp determination. Inside, the boutique was quieter now, the crowd thinner. The manager stood near the register, speaking in low tones with one of the sales associates. He froze when he saw her. "Miss Trump." His voice was smoother now, like silk stretched over cracks. "I didn't expect you back so soon." "No," she said evenly. "I imagine you didn't." He hesitated, searching for the right approach, but Ivanka didn't give him the chance. "I'll make this simple," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "I'm buying the bag." The manager blinked. "As I explained earlier, I'm not interested in your excuses." She stepped closer, her heels echoing on the marble floor. "You deliberately tried to humiliate me today. You assumed that because of my name, or your opinion of it, that I didn't belong here. Miss Trump, I assure you, I'm not finished." The manager's mouth snapped shut. Ivanka drew in a breath. She had dealt with men like him before, self-important gatekeepers who thrived on control. But she wasn't here to play his game. "You may think you understand reputation," she said, her voice low but steady. "But let me remind you, mine didn't buy me a seat at the table. I earned it." His expression flickered, but she didn't stop. "You judged me the moment I walked through that door. You made assumptions about my character, my taste, and my worth. But what you failed to consider is how quickly reputations can shift, yours included." A muscle twitched in his jaw. Ivanka took out her phone, scrolling through her contacts before pressing a name. She held the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving his. "Hi, Christine," she said when the line connected. "I'm at Daventry on 5th. Yes, the boutique." The manager paled. Ivanka didn't flinch. "I'm dealing with an issue regarding customer service and professionalism, or rather, a complete lack of both." Christine Harrington's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and clear. "Excuse me?" "The staff here," Ivanka continued, "made it very clear they don't think I, or clients like me, belong. I'm sure you can imagine how disappointing that is." "Put me on speaker," Christine said. Ivanka did. "This is Christine Harrington," the voice boomed, filling the boutique. "I don't know who I'm speaking to, but I expect you to identify yourself immediately." The manager's lips parted, but no sound came out. I'm the store manager, Miss Harrington," he stammered. "Well, Mr. Foster," he managed. "Well, Mr. Foster, let me make something very clear. I've spent years curating partnerships with businesses like yours, and I will not tolerate one of my closest associates being treated like an outsider in a place where she came to spend money. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," he said quickly. "Good. Now you're going to apologize to Miss Trump and complete her purchase. And when she leaves, you're going to review your staff policies, because if I hear about this kind of behavior again, you won't just lose one customer. You'll lose every connection I have." "Yes, ma'am," Foster said again, his face red. "Excellent. Ivanka?" "Thank you, Christine." "Any time." The call ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The manager turned to Ivanka, his voice tight. "I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding." She didn't smile. "Ring it up," she said. The transaction was completed in minutes, but the tension lingered long after. The sales associate who had earlier fumbled with the payment handed her the bag, her hands trembling. "Thank you," Ivanka said, her tone polite but firm. "I trust this won't happen again." The manager nodded stiffly. Ivanka turned and walked out without another word. As the glass doors swung shut behind her, she felt a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. She had won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. Back in the SUV, she stared at the bag resting on the seat beside her. It was beautiful, everything she had wanted, but the fight to claim it had left a bitter taste. She thought of Christine's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the noise. Ivanka had wielded that power, but it hadn't erased the stares, the whispers, or the sting of being doubted. The city lights blurred outside the window as the SUV rolled forward. She gripped the leather handles of the bag and tried to convince herself that winning the battle had been worth it. But deep down, she wasn't sure. Ivanka leaned back against the cool leather seat of the SUV as it glided away from the boutique, her eyes fixed on the emerald green clutch resting beside her. It was supposed to symbolize elegance, success, and confidence, a token of appreciation for her most valued client. Instead, it felt heavier than it should have, weighted by everything that had happened within those pristine walls. The manager's apology had been rehearsed, hollow, and offered only after being cornered. The bag was hers, but the victory felt artificial, a hollow echo of the power struggle that had unfolded. She exhaled and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the messages that had piled up while she was inside. Christine Harrington had already sent a follow-up text. Handled? Ivanka hesitated before typing back. Handled? The word tasted bitter. Was it handled? Yes, the bag was purchased. Yes, the manager had been humiliated into compliance, but no part of the experience had felt like success. She had relied on influence, pulled strings, and reminded them of her connections, but it hadn't erased the deeper insult, the fact that they had judged her unworthy in the first place. She locked her phone and stared out the window, watching the city rush past in streaks of neon and glass. Her reflection stared back at her, sharp cheekbones and perfect hair framing a face that had been trained to mask uncertainty. But tonight, the cracks showed. The car slowed as it reached the entrance to her building, and the driver stepped out to open the door. She nodded to him absently and walked through the lobby, barely noticing the polished marble floors or the doorman's greeting. Upstairs, in her apartment, the silence pressed in on her. She set the bag down on the kitchen island, its emerald surface catching the light, and poured herself a glass of water. The room felt too big, too still. She thought about calling Jared, but the idea of explaining what had happened felt exhausting. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed Christine. The older woman answered on the first ring. "I assume everything is taken care of?" "It is," Ivanka said, her voice steady but quieter than usual. "Good. I hope Foster understands what's at stake." "I think he does." Christine paused. "You don't sound satisfied." Ivanka leaned against the counter, staring at the clutch. "I don't know what I expected," she admitted, "but it wasn't this. This? Having to prove myself, having to remind people who I am." Christine's laugh was sharp. "Ivanka, people like us always have to prove ourselves. The difference is, we know how." "Maybe," Ivanka said, swirling the water in her glass, "but it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like surviving." Christine's voice softened. It doesn't matter how it feels. What matters is that you didn't back down. That's what people remember. Ivanka hung up soon after, but Christine's words lingered. What did people remember? That she had gotten what she wanted, or how much she'd had to fight to get it? Her gaze fell on the clutch again. It was beautiful, flawless, a symbol of everything the boutique claimed to stand for. But all she could see now was the look in the manager's eyes. Calculated and dismissive, already deciding she wasn't good enough before she had even spoken. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hands. Was this what success felt like now? Buying her way past judgment? Using influence to silence whispers? Setting it down again, she walked into the living room and sank into the couch. She thought about her father and the lessons he had drilled into her. Power was everything. Control the room, control the narrative, and you'll control the outcome. But tonight, she hadn't felt in control. She had felt like a spectacle, a curiosity, a target. And the more she tried to convince herself it didn't matter, the more it did. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment in the boutique when the whispers had been loudest. She doesn't belong here. That phrase echoed in her mind, sharper now, cutting deeper than it should have. What if they were right? She closed her eyes, trying to push the thought away, but it lingered. It had been lingering for months, even years, ever since she stepped out of the White House and tried to rebuild a life outside the shadow of her father's presidency. No matter what she achieved, the world always seemed ready to reduce her to a name and nothing more. Her phone buzzed again. Another text. This time it wasn't Christine. It was her mother. Saw the photos online. Are you okay? Of course, there were photos. There were always photos. Someone had snapped her walking out of the boutique, probably mid-stride, her face tight with barely contained frustration. It would be dissected by the press, analyzed for hidden meanings. Ivanka Trump storms out after shopping spat. Or something equally ridiculous. She didn't reply. Instead, she scrolled through her notifications. The incident had already made waves. Social media was full of comments. Some called her entitled. Others cheered her for standing up to rude staff. But the loudest voices were the cruelest. Karma. Daddy's girl can't buy her way out of this one. Serves her right. Ivanka closed the app and tossed her phone onto the couch. She didn't need to read more. She already knew what they thought of her. Pushing herself to her feet, she walked back to the kitchen and picked up the clutch again. For a moment, she considered throwing it in the trash, but she didn't. Instead, she set it back down gently, like it might shatter if she dropped it. It wasn't just a bag anymore. It was a reminder, a symbol of the power she wielded and the resentment it inspired. And it made her wonder if she would ever truly escape it. The thought stayed with her as she turned off the lights and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The whispers followed her, even in the dark. The city was still cloaked in darkness when Ivanka woke up. She hadn't slept much. Her mind refused to rest, replaying the scene in the boutique over and over. She could still see the manager's smirk, still hear the whispers that had followed her like shadows. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, before finally pushing herself upright. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The emerald green clutch sat on the counter, catching the dim morning light that seeped through the curtains. It seemed almost defiant, as if daring her to confront everything it represented. She rose, wrapping herself in a silk robe, and padded barefoot into the living room. Her phone was already buzzing, emails, notifications, news alerts. She ignored most of them, but one headline caught her eye. Ivanka, Trump faces backlash after confrontation in luxury boutique. Her stomach sank. She clicked the link. The article recounted the incident in excruciating detail, piecing together eyewitness accounts and anonymous quotes from boutique staff. Sources inside the store claim Trump demanded preferential treatment, attempting to leverage her connections to bypass standard policies. Witnesses described the scene as tense, with Trump allegedly berating employees before calling a high-profile associate to intervene. Ivanka's grip tightened on the phone. It wasn't true, not entirely, but it didn't matter. Truth had never mattered when it came to public perception. The comments below the article were worse. Entitled brat. Typical. Throws a tantrum when she doesn't get her way. She can't buy class. She shut the phone off and dropped it onto the couch, her pulse quickening. No matter what she did, it always came back to this: her name, her family, her past. Her gaze drifted back to the clutch. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was beautiful, perfect in its craftsmanship, but now it felt tainted. She had fought for it, claimed it, but the victory rang hollow. She thought about the confrontation with the manager, about Christine's voice echoing through the speakerphone, about the way the staff had looked at her, not with respect, but with fear. She had won, but at what cost? Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Power isn't given, it's taken. But for the first time, she wondered if taking it had left her emptier than before. The day stretched on, and Ivanka tried to focus on work, but the story wouldn't go away. News outlets picked it up, dissecting every detail. Some defended her, calling it a stand against elitism and poor customer service. Others used it as another example of her privilege, proof that she expected the world to bend to her will. By evening, the boutique released a statement. We deeply regret the misunderstanding that occurred with Miss Trump and have taken steps to ensure all clients receive the exceptional service they deserve. We value her patronage and look forward to welcoming her again in the future. The apology was calculated, sterile, and meaningless. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't erase the whispers. The phone rang. Christine. I saw the statement, Christine said as soon as Ivanka answered. So did I. It's weak, but it's enough to bury the story. Give it 48 hours and no one will care. Ivanka leaned against the counter, staring at the clutch. I care. Christine paused. What do you mean? I care that it happened at all. I care that it keeps happening. Christine's voice softened. Ivanka, this is the cost of being who you are. People are always going to look for ways to tear you down. I know that, Ivanka said, but I'm starting to wonder if it's worth it. Christine didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. Then maybe it's time to ask yourself what you're really fighting for. The question lingered long after the call ended. Ivanka stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The streets pulsed with life. Cars, taxis, people moving in every direction. She had always loved this view, the sense of possibility it carried, but tonight it felt distant, like something she could see but not touch. She thought about her father again, about the lessons he had drilled into her since she was a child. Never let them see you sweat. Never let them think they've won. But what if winning felt like losing? She picked up the clutch and carried it to the bedroom. Setting it on the dresser, she stared at it for a long moment before turning away. Sleep didn't come easily that night, but when it finally did, her dreams were filled with mirrors, endless reflections of herself, each one slightly different, but none of them quite right. When she woke the next morning, the first thing she did was call Christine. "I'm sending the bag back," she said. Christine's voice sharpened. "Excuse me?" "I'm sending it back." "Why? You fought for it." "That's the problem," Ivanka said. "It shouldn't have been a fight, and it's not worth carrying something that's going to remind me of it every time I look at it." Christine sighed. "Are you sure about this?" "I am." For the first time in days, she felt certain. Later that afternoon, she walked back into the boutique. The staff froze when they saw her, their eyes wide and wary. The manager stepped forward cautiously. "Miss Trump." She handed him the bag, its emerald surface gleaming under the lights. "I'm returning this," she said. "No refund necessary." The manager blinked. "But I don't want it," she said firmly, "and I don't need it." She turned and walked out, leaving the bag and the weight it carried behind. Outside, the air felt lighter. The whispers might never stop, but for the first time, she didn't care. She had spent her entire life trying to prove her worth to people who had already made up their minds about her. Maybe it was time to stop. The SUV pulled up and she climbed inside, closing the door with a quiet click. As the car rolled forward, she glanced back at the boutique one last time before letting it disappear into the distance. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and leave comments. Where are you watching from? Your opinion is important to us. Watch other videos on the channel. There's a lot more interesting stuff there.